Deep within the forests of North America, thousands of people claim that something is hiding. Something large, hair-covered, walking upright on two legs. For decades, witnesses have reported enormous footprints, strange sounds, and fleeting encounters with a creature popularly known as Bigfoot. Then, in 1967, two men returned from a remote California creek with something extraordinary. Film apparently showing a massive, human-like creature walking through the wilderness. More than half a century later, that footage remains controversial. But there's a much bigger question. Could an undiscovered giant primate actually survive in North America without science confirming its existence? Tonight, we're going beyond the stories. We're examining the footprints, the film, the DNA, the fossil record, and the biology an animal like Bigfoot would require to survive. Because whether Bigfoot exists or not, the evidence tells a fascinating story. This is beyond theory. Stories involving mysterious, wild beings existed long before anyone used the word Bigfoot. Different indigenous cultures across North America have their own distinct traditions involving powerful, wild, or human-like beings. Those traditions shouldn't simply be treated as interchangeable versions of the modern Bigfoot story. The creature most people picture today developed much more recently, and one important moment occurred in Northern California. The year was 1958. Construction workers building a road near Bluff Creek began reporting enormous human-like footprints. The tracks were far larger than those of an ordinary person. One worker, Jerry Crew, made plaster casts of the footprints. Photographs of Crew holding one of the enormous casts appeared in newspapers, and a name began spreading through popular culture: Bigfoot. The story exploded. Suddenly, a mysterious creature supposedly wandering the forests of North America had an unforgettable name. But decades later, the story took an unexpected turn. After the death of contractor Ray Wallace in 2002, members of his family said Wallace had been involved in creating Bigfoot tracks using carved wooden feet. That revelation cast serious doubt over some of the footprints connected with the early Bluff Creek phenomenon. But it didn't end the Bigfoot story. Far from it. Because 9 years after the 1958 reports, something happened at Bluff Creek that would transform Bigfoot from a story about footprints into something people could actually watch. October 20th, 1967. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were traveling through the Bluff Creek area of Northern California. Then they reportedly encountered something extraordinary. Patterson's camera captured a large, dark, hair-covered figure moving across an open area before disappearing toward the trees. The footage was short, shaky, grainy, but one moment became iconic. The figure turns its upper body toward the camera, looks back, and continues walking. The recording became known as the Patterson-Gimlin film, and decades later, it remains perhaps the most famous piece of alleged Bigfoot evidence ever captured. Supporters argue that certain features of the figure appear unusual for a person wearing a costume. They point to its proportions, its walking motion, and what some interpret as movement beneath the hair. Others argue there is a much simpler explanation: a human being wearing a suit. And that's the fundamental problem with the film. No matter how many times it's enhanced, stabilized, slowed down, or analyzed, the footage itself cannot provide us with a biological specimen. We don't have tissue. We don't have bone. We don't have DNA from the figure. The film may be fascinating, but fascinating isn't the same thing as scientifically verified. And that leaves us with two possibilities. Either Patterson captured one of the most extraordinary zoological discoveries of modern history, or we're watching something much more ordinary. So if a film can't settle the question, perhaps something else can. Something much harder to argue with. DNA. If Bigfoot is a biological animal, it should have DNA. Hair should contain biological information. Tissue should contain biological information. Waste should contain biological information. So eventually, you would expect science to encounter genetic material belonging to something it couldn't identify. In 2014, researchers led by geneticist Brian Sykes published one of the most significant scientific investigations of alleged anomalous primate hair. Samples associated with creatures such as Bigfoot and the Yeti were submitted for genetic analysis. Researchers successfully obtained DNA sequences from 30 samples. This was exactly the kind of test the mystery needed. If one of those hairs belonged to an unknown primate, the genetic evidence could potentially reveal it. But that's not what happened. The tested hairs were attributed to known mammals, rather than providing genetic evidence for an unknown non-human primate. That doesn't prove that Bigfoot cannot exist. That's an important distinction. Science rarely proves that something could never exist anywhere. Instead, the study tested specific physical evidence presented as potentially belonging to unknown primates, and those samples failed to establish the existence of one, which creates a serious problem, because after decades of reported encounters, we still don't have a scientifically verified Bigfoot specimen. But supporters sometimes point toward another animal. A creature that wasn't mythical. A creature we know existed. And it was enormous. Imagine an ape standing perhaps 3 meters tall and weighing hundreds of kilograms. That sounds like something from a Bigfoot story, except this animal was real. Its name was Gigantopithecus blacki. Gigantopithecus is considered the largest known primate ever to have existed. Its fossil record includes enormous teeth and several jawbones. Recent research estimates that it may have reached around 3 meters in height and weighed somewhere in the region of 200 to 300 kilograms. So nature has already demonstrated something important. Giant apes are biologically possible, but there's a major problem with using Gigantopithecus as evidence for Bigfoot. It lived in Asia. Its known fossil remains come from southern China, and it disappeared an extraordinarily long time ago. Research published in Nature in 2024 placed its extinction window at approximately 295,000 to 215,000 years ago. Researchers found that its environment was changing. Forests became more open. Food availability shifted. And unlike some other primates, Gigantopithecus appears to have struggled to adapt. Eventually, the world's largest known primate disappeared. There is currently no evidence demonstrating that Gigantopithecus survived into modern times, and no established fossil record showing that it created a surviving population in North America. So Gigantopithecus tells us that giant apes can exist. It doesn't tell us that Bigfoot does. And perhaps we don't need an extinct giant ape to explain at least some sightings, because North America already contains another enormous animal, one that can stand upright. Imagine walking through a forest at dusk. Visibility is poor. Trees repeatedly block your view. Then, perhaps 50 meters away, something enormous rises onto 2 legs. You see it for only a few seconds. Then it disappears. What did you see? North America contains hundreds of thousands of black bears. And although bears normally move on 4 legs, they can stand upright and move short distances on their hind legs. Under the right conditions, the silhouette can appear surprisingly human-like. Researchers have actually examined whether bear populations could help explain reported Bigfoot sightings. A study published in the Journal of Zoology modeled reported Sasquatch sightings alongside American black bear populations across the United States and Canada. The study found an association. Areas with larger bear populations tended to have more reported Bigfoot sightings, even after the model accounted for factors including human population and forest area. That doesn't mean every Bigfoot witness saw a bear. It doesn't prove that. But it demonstrates that a known large animal provides a plausible explanation for at least some reports. And human perception isn't perfect, especially when something happens unexpectedly. Distance matters. Lighting matters. Fear matters. Expectations matter. And sometimes, You only get a few seconds to decide what you're looking at. But even if we remove every possible bear sighting, we're left with an even bigger problem. Because if Bigfoot really exists, there can't be just one. This might be the most important part of the entire investigation. For Bigfoot to exist today, we don't simply need one mysterious animal hiding somewhere in a forest. We need a population. A species needs enough individuals to reproduce over generations. That means males, females, young, older animals, animals moving between territories, animals searching for food, and eventually, animals dying. A large primate would require a significant amount of energy. It would leave tracks, hair, waste, feeding signs, DNA, and eventually, physical remains. Yet despite decades of reported encounters and searching, there is still no scientifically authenticated Bigfoot body, no accepted recent fossil, and no verified genetic sample establishing the existence of an unknown giant North American primate. That doesn't make concealment impossible. Forests are enormous. Animals decompose. Scavengers scatter remains. Humans don't search every square kilometer of wilderness. But as the proposed animal becomes larger, and the proposed population becomes larger, remaining completely undetected becomes increasingly difficult. And that gives us the central biological problem with Bigfoot. We're not asking whether one animal could hide. We're asking whether an entire breeding population of enormous primates could remain scientifically undocumented. Generation after generation after generation.